Hello and welcome back to another Games Workshop painting tutorial. In this video I'm going to be showing you how you can paint the Kairic Acolytes from the Warhammer Quest Silver Tower box set. And as always I'll be using the Citadel range of paints and brushes to do so. So here we have the Kairic Acolyte that I'll be painting as part of this tutorial. Now the miniature I'm using is the Acolyte with the shields, and I've just kept the shield separate here as it makes painting much easier later on. Now I've primed the miniature using the Army Painter's Uniform Grey spray primer as it gives me this really nice grey colour in which to work from. Alternatively you could use any generic grey spray primer. Now the first task is to paint all of the skin on this miniature, and we'll be starting off by base coating with Rakarth Flesh. As we're painting over this nice grey base colour, it makes it a lot easier to paint, and especially because Rakarth Flesh is a base colour as well. However, I've mixed in a very small amount of water into the mix, and I'm going to be applying 2 coats, and this will give us a really nice and even coverage to start off with. With the base coat applied, the next step is to wash over the flesh areas with Reikland Flesh Shade. At the moment the flesh is a little bit pale and pallid, so by applying this wash we're not only improving the definition in between the muscles, but we're also bringing a little bit of life into the flesh as well. The next step in painting our Acolyte is to highlight the flesh areas, and first we'll be using Kislev Flesh. For this step I've mixed in roughly a quarter of the mix is Lamia Medium, or you could use water just to thin it down slightly. I'm just going to be focusing this Kislev Flesh on the raised sections of the muscles, leaving the darker skin colour visible in the recesses. The next step in tackling the skin is to perform an extreme highlight, and we're going to be focusing on some of the top areas here and some of the extreme edges such as the knuckles as well. We're painting all of these areas with Flayed One Flesh. So as I mentioned before, we'll be focusing this highlight on the extreme, so just picking out some of these top edges very finely, just very thin lines just along the tops there. And some of the areas such as the knuckles as well, we'll just be picking those out. The next step in painting our Kairic Acolyte is to paint some of the mutations around the feet and also the back of the head, and we're basing these with Bugman's Glow, mixed in with a small amount of Lamia Medium. Now for these areas we want to achieve a nice transition from the darker skin colour to the brighter skin colour of the rest of the leg, and so we've mixed in a small amount of Lamia Medium, and this will allow us to make a nice glaze gradient as we go up. So you can see here it's quite fluid, the mixes. I'm just painting across the foot and just slightly up the leg as well, and when this dries it will create a nice gradient up the foot. Once the base coat is dry, the next step is to improve some of the definition, especially among the toes, and for this we'll be applying a wash of Carroburg Crimson. When applying this wash I'll be targeting it around the toes, such as just the front here, and also around the base of the foot, and this creates a just enhances the gradient going from the bottom of the toes and the foot up to the rest of the normal skin colour on the rest of the leg. The next step is to tackle any of the leather areas such as the belt here, the horn, the toes on the feet there as well, and any straps across the miniature such as these leather straps holding the shield as well. And we're painting all of these areas with Abaddon Black. As Abaddon Black is a base paint, you should have no problem painting these areas. I'm just being careful not to spill onto the skin at this point, and also if you can, try not to spill onto the grey areas such as the cloth there, as it will make painting the next step a little bit more tricky. The next step in painting our Acolyte is to highlight all the black areas that we painted in the previous step with Dark Reaper. So for this step we just want to be picking out these edges on the belt around the waist there. The reason I'm using Dark Reaper as opposed to Mechanicus Standard Grey or one of the other greys is because it's got a slight blue tinge, and as this miniature has quite a blue feel to it, I think it would complement the rest of the miniature really nicely. At the moment the Dark Reaper highlight is a little bit too dark, so we're going to be bringing it up a little bit more by applying a second finer highlight of Thunderhawk Blue. This time, instead of focusing on all of the raised sections, I'll just be choosing the ones that are towards the top of the miniature, so just such as this little fold here in the strap and along this top strap just there, just going over the Thunderhawk Blue. With the black areas completed, we can now start to work on the tunic around the waist, and for this we'll be applying a base coat of Celestra Grey. Because Celestra Grey is a base paint, it gives us a really nice starting point in painting this tabard if we want to build this up to a near white finish. You can see here it's quite light and applies nice and easily as well. So now that we've completed the first step, which is basing the cloth in Celestra Grey, the next step is to apply a wash of Bugman Blue. Now this is because we want to achieve a slightly blue tone to the cloth, and we don't want to apply it straight out the pot. We want to mix in a small amount of water or some Lamium Medium. So the mix of Bugman Blue and Lamium Medium that I've got here is roughly 50-50. You can see it's very slight wash, just pulls into the recesses nicely, giving it a very pale blue colour. Once the wash has dried, the next step is to very carefully highlight the raised folds here, and for this we'll be using Ulthran Grey. For this step I've mixed in roughly 1 part water to 3 parts Ulthran Grey, and I'm just going to be very carefully picking out these folds in the cloth there, just making these very thin lines, and also along the edge of the cloth as well, and I'll be doing this all the way across the miniature wherever we've painted this cloth. With the white cloth completed, the next step is to focus on any the blue and purple cloth, such as the loin cloth that we've got here, and we'll be base coating these with Kantor Blue. As Kantor Blue is a base paint, you should have no problem going over these areas, over the grey. Just be very careful when you come to paint near the white areas. It can be quite difficult to repaint over them if you overspill. With the base coat completed, the next step is to start working on the gradient from the purple to the top to the blue at the bottom. And for this we'll be using Xerius Purple, and we'll be starting right at the top just as a highlight along the folds of the cloth. For this step I've mixed in 1 part water to 2 parts Xerius Purple. I'm just going to be focusing this along these raised sections of the cloth just at the top here. Just being very careful just to pick them out slightly. As you can see there, it's creating a nice blend as it goes down towards the bottom of the cloth. I'm going to be doing this across any areas on the miniature which have this blue-purple cloth. Now that we have both the purple and the blue base colours down, the next step is to apply a wash which will not only blend the 2 gradients but also improve the shading in the recesses. And for this we'll be using Druchii Violet. When applying this wash we don't want to be too liberal with its application. We just want to make sure it pools in the recesses though, making sure it gets across the entirety of the miniature, not overspilling onto the white I should add, and you can just sort of see here we're getting a nice gradient between the 2 colours. Once the wash is dried, we can now start with the highlights, and first of all we'll be highlighting the top of the cloth around the purple areas, picking out the folds with Genestealer Purple. In order to enhance the gradient, we're just going to be focusing this highlight at the very top of the cloth, just beneath the belt like so, just picking out these folds in the cloth like so. Finally, to highlight the bottom of the tabard, we'll be picking out the raised sections with Teclis Blue. In much the same way as we applied the last highlight, we'll be picking out the folds towards the bottom of the tabard. Just be very careful here, just to lightly pick out the creases with this thin brush here. Once the tabard is complete, we can now start working on some of the armour sections, or this shield panel here that are blue. And for this we'll be base coating, first of all, with Caledor Sky. As Caledor Sky is a base paint, and as we're painting over this grey primer, you should have no problem covering, getting really nice coverage here, as you can see I'm doing. Just being careful not to overspill onto the metallic sections, as it makes it a little bit easier to paint them later on. Once the base coat is dried, we can now start working on the next step, and for this we'll be applying a glaze of Temple Guard Blue, mixed in roughly 50-50 quantities with Lamium Medium. Now if you've been watching my channel, you're probably already aware of what a glaze is. However, if you're not, it's essentially a very watered down paint, and when we apply it to the surface, as you'll be able to see here, it's very thin, very watered down. And what we can do is we can just apply layer upon layer, allowing the previous layer to dry thoroughly first, and this will create a nice gradient. So we're going to be focusing mainly along this edge here, and then grading towards the inside of the shield. With the glaze completed on the shield, the next step is to tie in the blending and also apply some shading in the recesses by using another wash of Bugman Blue. While I haven't watered down the wash as much as I have done in the previous step, I have added in a small amount of water just to improve the flow slightly. You can see I'm just applying the wash across the blue areas, making sure it pools nicely into the recesses. Once the glaze has dried on the shield, the next step is to highlight this very edge here, and for this we'll be using Rakarth Blue. Using the Rakarth Blue, we just want to highlight the very edge here, just to get a line on the edge of the shield like so. And this creates a nice highlight on the miniature. The next step in painting our miniature is to pick out any of the gems or the eyes on the miniature, such as these sections on the shield here. And first of all, we'll be painting these with Cabalite Green. Because we aren't working with the base paint here, I would recommend thinning down the mixture slightly with a little bit of Lamium Medium or water. Wait for the first coat that you apply to dry thoroughly before applying the second coat, and this will give you a really nice an even coverage to start off with. The next step is to highlight any of the gems in the eyes across the miniature, and for this we'll be using Sybarite Green. Now when we come to apply this layer, you want to focus on the top section. So for example, these areas on the shield is going to be picking out the top half of the eye, same on the small one here as well. And so just create the illusion of light hitting the top of the shield. The next step in painting these green areas is to paint a very fine line along the top of the lens there with Gauss Blaster Green. In much the same way as we did before, I'm going to be focusing this highlight along the very top edge, but just on a very fine line along the top there, as you can see I'm doing. Now the final step is an optional one, and for this we're going to be painting a very fine line to represent an eye, and for this we'll be using Abaddon Black. For this step I would recommend using a thin brush, and you just want to draw a thin line down the centre of the lens like so, and we'll be applying the same on these smaller eyes as well. With the eyes and the gems completed, the next step is to paint any of the bone items on the miniature, such as this little bird skull that we've got here, and for this we'll be base coating with Rakarth Flesh. So for any bone items on the miniature, we'll just be base coating them with the Rakarth Flesh. You can see I'm just doing here, just being careful not to overspill onto the areas we've already painted, such as the loincloth that we've got just here. Once the base coat is applied, the next step is to wash over the areas with Seraphim Sepia. Seraphim Sepia makes an excellent wash for bone areas, as it kind of gives you some nice shading in the recesses without darkening the colour too much. The final step for painting these bone areas is to highlight them with a Screaming Skull. When you come to do your highlights, you want to focus on the top sections, leaving the darker Seraphim Sepia wash still visible in the recesses. You can just see him here, just picking out the nostrils and also the beak as well. With the bone areas completed, the next step is to move on to the metallic areas, and for this we'll be painting the blade of the weapon there with Leadbelcher. As the Leadbelcher is a base paint, you should have no problem covering over the grey primer here. I'm just going to make sure we get a nice and even base in which to build up on. Now that the base coat is applied, we want to lighten up the overall colour of the blade, and for this we'll be applying a layer of Ironbreaker. When applying the Ironbreaker, we want to focus on some of the top areas, such as this section of the blade here, and also the actual bladed section just along the front there, picking it out with a lighter, brighter silver colour. So the next step is to paint all of the gold areas, and this includes the mask, the hilt on the weapon there, and also any adornments around the belt and the loincloth, and any jewellery such as this around the ankle. And also on this particular miniature we'll also be painting the metallic areas on the shield gold as well. And for this we'll be using Retributor Armour. The great thing about Retributor Armour is the fact that it's a really bright gold, and also the fact that it's a base paint, which means it's great for starting out any of these gold areas like we're doing here. So I'm just being careful, making sure to apply all over the areas, but not overspill onto the areas that we've already painted. The next step in painting the gold areas is to wash over them with Seraphim Sepia. By washing over the gold with the Seraphim Sepia, we get some nice shading in the recesses, and also because it's only a kind of sepia tone, it doesn't dull the gold colour too much. You can just see I'm doing here on the mask. Now the final step in painting our miniature is to highlight both the gold and also the silver areas with Runefang Steel. When performing this highlight, we want to focus our efforts mainly along the very fine edges, just like this along the top here, just picking them out very carefully. And then when we actually come to the blade itself, we want to pick out this ridge that runs up the centre of the blade, and then also the actual bladed edge itself. And here we have the completed miniature, who you can see I've attached the shield to and also based. Now whilst this tutorial just focused on the shield bearing Karic Acolytes, you could apply the same techniques to any of the Acolytes, including the Adept. Now if you enjoyed this tutorial and would like to see more, do let me know in the comments below, and also subscribe to be kept up to date with all of my future videos. Additionally, if you would like to support me in making more videos, you can do so by heading over to my Patreon page, which you can find a link for in the description. From there you can donate to me from as little as $1 a month, which will just help me to produce more tutorials in the future. So until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.